Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
They attacked my house at 5:30 in the morning. A group of at least 200 to 250 armed soldiers with hoods and bulletproof vests and rifles aimed their guns at me, fired shots, used machine guns, kicked down the doors, and just as I was in pajamas, they put me on a plane and flew me to Costa Rica.
Nearly a decade after a U.S.-backed coup in Honduras ousted the democratically elected president, we look at how the political crisis in Honduras today has led to thousands fleeing to the U.S. border seeking asylum. This comes as the brother of the current Honduran president was just arrested in Miami on drug trafficking charges. We'll speak with Dana Frank, author of the new book, The Long Honduran Night: Resistance, Terror, and the United States in the Aftermath of the Coup. Then we look at U.S. border authorities' tear gassing of asylum seekers on the U.S.-Mexican border.
The tear gas is a very minor form of the tear gas itself. It's very safe. The ones that were suffering to a certain extent were the people that were putting it out there, but it's very safe.
The head of U.S. Border Patrol said the pepper spray would go well on the migrants' nachos. We'll speak to a historian who studied how tear gas went from a weapon of war used on Vietnam to being deployed by law enforcement at home. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations warns in a new report that humanity is doing far too little to limit global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, a target of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord that would prevent the worst effects of catastrophic climate change. The UN found the rate of global carbon dioxide emissions rose last year for the first time in 4 years and is expected to climb again for 2018, with the world on pace to see a global rise of 3.2 degrees Celsius, or nearly 6 degrees Fahrenheit, by the end of the century. Such a rise would see devastating droughts, floods, and extreme weather, with increased sea level, crop failures, mass migration, and global conflict. The UN is calling for new investments in renewable energy and for governments to replace subsidies on fossil fuels with taxes to discourage their use. The stark warning came ahead of the UN climate talks set for Katowice, Poland, next month. Democracy Now! Will broadcast from the talks during the week of December 10th. In Mexico, the government of President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador has signaled it will hold Central American migrants on Mexican soil while they wait to hear whether their applications for political asylum are granted by the U.S. Mexico's incoming foreign minister said Tuesday the Trump administration should in return pay at least $20 billion for a Marshall Plan-style program aimed at developing the economies of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. It's not clear what services Mexico would provide migrants hoping to win U.S. asylum. At the crossing between Tijuana and San Diego, U.S. officials are processing only about 100 claims per day, even as thousands of migrants are living in squalid open-air camps near the border while they await their turn to apply for asylum. Customs and Border Patrol says the migrants may have to wait up to 6 weeks to have their appeals heard. This comes as the Trump administration defended the Border Patrol for firing tear gas into crowds of migrants, including mothers and children, as they tried to cross the U.S. border from Tijuana Sunday. This is Ronald Colburn, president of the Border Patrol Foundation, former national deputy chief of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, speaking on Fox and Friends Monday.
The type of deterrent being used is OC pepper spray. It's literally water, pepper, with a small amount of alcohol for evaporation purposes. It's natural. You could actually put it on your nachos and eat it. So it's a good way of deterring people without long-term harm.
Democrats are blasting the Trump administration for its treatment of asylum seekers. Democratic National Committee Chair Tom Perez tweeted, quote, "Shooting tear gas at children is not who we are as Americans." But new findings reveal Customs and Border Protection fired tear gas dozens of times under President Obama. In a statement sent to Newsweek Tuesday, CBP said it first acquired tear gas in 2010 and deployed the substance 126 times since 2012. The data showed tear gas use has increased under President Trump. We'll have more on the tear gassing of migrants on the U.S.-Mexico border later in the broadcast. In Texas, a newly revealed memo shows the Trump administration waived rigorous background checks for all staff at a sprawling tent camp where migrant children are imprisoned in the desert outside El Paso. The memo from the Health and Human Services Department's Inspector General shows the Office of Refugee Resettlement approved a plan to sidestep requirements for FBI fingerprinting checks, along with child abuse and neglect checks for 2,100 staffers at the Tornillo tent city. And the camp was allowed to sidestep mental health requirements, which require one mental health clinician for every 12 children. Tornillo has just one clinician for every 100 children. The Trump administration established the tent camp in Tornillo in June as a temporary shelter amidst the administration's zero-tolerance policy, which included forcibly separating children from their parents. It's since expanded to contain 3,800 beds for migrant children, with officials saying they're unlikely to meet federal plans to close Tornillo by New Year's Eve. In Mississippi, Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith has won a runoff special election for U.S. Senate seat vacated by Thad Cochran, who retired early this year for health reasons. Hyde-Smith's victory came after she joked about hangings on the campaign trail and after photos emerged showing her posing with a Confederate Army cap and rifle. Hyde-Smith captioned the photos on Facebook, "Mississippi history at its best." Hyde-Smith beat her Democratic challenger, former Congressman Mike Espy, who's African-American, with 53.9% of the vote. The outcome gives Republicans a 53 to 47 majority in the Senate, while Democrats will take control of the House after gaining at least 39 seats. There's one more House in contention in California House seat. Russia is sending advanced surface-to-air missiles to the Crimean Peninsula amidst mounting tensions with Ukraine. The escalation comes after Russia's Navy captured 3 Ukrainian ships Sunday and arrested sailors near a narrow waterway separating Russia from Crimea, which Russia seized and illegally annexed in 2014. On Tuesday, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said Ukraine faces the prospect of an all-out war with Russia.
These Russian tanks were not withdrawn yet. They remain there at the Ukraine-Russia border. And that's why I don't want anyone to think that it's entertainment or a game. The country is under the threat of a full-fledged war with the Russian Federation.
The Trump administration said Tuesday it may end subsidies to General Motors, including for electric cars, after GM said Monday it'll close factories and cut up to 15,000 jobs across North America. The announcement came as President Trump blasted Federal Reserve Chair Jerome J. Powell on Tuesday, telling the Washington Post he blamed the Fed for GM's job cuts as well as a recent fall in stock market prices. Trump told the Washington Post, quote, "I'm doing deals and I'm not being accommodated by the Fed. They're making a mistake because I have a gut, and my gut tells me more sometimes than anybody else's brain can ever tell me. So far, I'm not even a little bit happy with my selection of Jay, not even a little bit," Trump said. In the wide-ranging interview, Trump also said he's considering canceling a planned meeting with Russian leader Vladimir Putin in Argentina later this week over Russia's attack on 3 Ukrainian ships off the coast of Crimea. Trump once again attacked his own administration's report on climate change released last week, warning of dire consequences of inaction on curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Trump said, quote, "We have very high levels of intelligence, but we're not necessarily such believers. You look at our air and our water, and it's right now at a record clean," unquote. And Trump once again defended Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, saying maybe he did and maybe he didn't order the killing of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Trump's comment came after the White House reportedly barred CIA Chief Gina Haspel and other intelligence officials from briefing U.S. senators about Khashoggi's killing. Today's briefing will instead be led by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a staunch defender of the Saudi royal family. The CIA has concluded with high confidence that Crown Prince bin Salman is directly implicated in ordering Khashoggi's murder, and Gina Haspel's reportedly heard audio of the killing intercepted by Turkish intelligence. At the White House, National Security Advisor John Bolton told reporters Tuesday he hasn't heard the tape and would not be listening to it.
No, I haven't listened to it. And I guess I should ask you, why do you think I should? What do you think I'll learn from it?
Well, you're the National Security Advisor. You might have access to that sort of intelligence.
Yeah. How many in this room speak Arabic?
You have access to an interpreter?
Well, you want me to listen to it? What am I going to learn from? I mean, if they were speaking Korean, I wouldn't learn any more from it either.
President Trump has also said he won't listen to the tape. He called it a suffering tape. Today's briefing of senators will come ahead of a crucial Senate vote on whether to withdraw U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, which has created what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis in a half a century, with 14 million of Yemen's 28 million people on the brink of famine. Today's vote comes after CNN quoted two sources saying the U.S. slammed the brakes on the UN Security Council resolution on a ceasefire in Yemen, reportedly after the Saudi Crown Prince threw a fit over a draft resolution. Meanwhile, Crown Prince bin Salman has arrived in Argentina for the G20 summit in Buenos Aires, where prosecutors are considering whether to use the legal doctrine of universal jurisdiction to charge him with war crimes and torture. Meanwhile, thousands of Argentines rallied Tuesday near the site of the summit to protest austerity measures being imposed by the International Monetary Fund and backed by G20 member nations in exchange for a $57 billion bailout of the Argentine economy. This is Argentinian activist Gaston Harispe.
The G20 is hunger and illegitimacy. This illegitimate and starving government launched this summit and comes to play a role of minor partner of this conglomerate of imperial countries that come to divide the world in the framework of the commercial war.
This comes as outgoing Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto said Mexico will bestow Mexico's highest honor for foreigners on Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, when Kushner arrives for the G20 talks in Argentina. The move drew scorn from prominent Mexicans, including actor Gael Garcia Bernal, who called the decision to award the Aztec Eagle tremendously shameful. Previous winners include Nelson Mandela and the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Syrian radio host and activist Raed Fares was shot dead in Idlib Friday, along with activist Hamoud Janeed. Fares founded Radio Fresh, an independent radio station broadcasting from inside opposition-held Syria. Fares joined the popular protests against the government of President Bashar al-Assad in 2011. In the following years, he documented the human cost of the war in Syria, exposing rights violations and the devastation of airstrikes on civilians. Fares was targeted by both the government and opposition militants. He survived previous assassination attempts at kidnapping and torture. Back in the United States, the New York Times reports lawyers for Donald Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, briefed the president at the White House about Manafort's cooperation with federal investigators working for special counsel Robert Mueller. The briefings by Manafort lawyer Kevin Downing were confirmed by Rudy Giuliani, one of President Trump's personal attorneys. The meetings were not illegal, but were highly unusual and reportedly infuriated investigators with Mueller's team. On Monday, the special counsel's office said Manafort violated his cooperation agreement with Robert Mueller by repeatedly lying to federal investigators. Meanwhile, lawyers for Julian Assange said the WikiLeaks founder will sue the Guardian newspaper for libel after it reported Tuesday that Paul Manafort held secret talks with Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London on 3 occasions. The alleged meetings occurred, the Guardian alleged, in 2013, 2015, and in March of 2016, around the time Manafort joined Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Lead author Luke Harding cited a, quote, well-placed source as the basis of the report. In a statement, Manafort called the report totally false and deliberately libelous. WikiLeaks said in a tweet, quote, WikiLeaks is willing to bet the Guardian $1 million and its editor's head that Manafort never met Assange. Former Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt coordinated with the Fox News channel ahead of multiple appearances on Fox and Friends, where he was presented with pre-screened, non-confrontational questions. That's according to the Daily Beast, which obtained emails showing Fox News producers allowing Pruitt's aides to dictate topics for interviews and even offered them script approval for Pruitt's introduction. After the report circulated, Fox News said in a statement, this is not standard practice whatsoever, and the matter is being addressed internally with those involved. It's the latest example of Fox News coordinating directly with Republican politicians. Earlier this month, Fox News hosts Jeanine Pirro and Sean Hannity appeared on stage at a Trump campaign rally ahead of the midterm elections. Former Fox News executive Bill Shine now works as Deputy Chief of Staff for White House Communications, and former White House Comms Director Hope Hicks now works as Head of Public Relations for Fox News parent company. In Louisiana, a judge heard arguments Tuesday in an eminent domain case that could help determine the fate of the 163-mile Bayou Bridge pipeline being built by Energy Transfer Partners, the same company behind the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline. Property owners whose land was seized for pipeline construction are suing Energy Transfer Partners, claiming it illegally stole and damaged private land for construction of the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which would carry nearly 500,000 barrels of oil per day across Louisiana's wetlands. A judge is expected to issue a ruling today after more testimony. And NASA's InSight mission has landed on Mars. InSight will explore the interior of the red planet with the most sensitive seismometer ever built into a space probe. NASA engineers erupted into applause Monday as InSight made its landing about 7 minutes after shedding its 12,000-mile-per-hour velocity to reach the surface safely in just under 7 minutes. It's the 8th successful landing on Mars by a NASA spacecraft. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. As the United States continues to face criticism for tear-gassing asylum seekers on the U.S.-Mexico border, we turn now to look at the crisis in Honduras and why so many Hondurans are fleeing their homeland. Honduras has become one of the most violent countries in the world because of the devastating drug war and the political crisis that stems in part from a U.S.-backed 2009 coup. In a major development, the brother of Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez was recently charged in the United States for drug trafficking and weapons offenses. Tony Hernandez was arrested in Miami on Friday. Manhattan U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman accused Tony Hernandez of being, quote, involved in all stages of the trafficking through Honduras of multi-ton loads of cocaine that were destined for the U.S. Hernandez is also accused of providing heavily armed security for cocaine shipments transported within Honduras, including by members of the Honduran National Police and drug traffickers. Tony Hernandez reportedly ran cocaine labs in Honduras and Colombia, where he stamped packets of drugs with his initials TH. The arrest of Hernandez comes a year after a U.S. judge sentenced the son of the former Honduran president, Porfirio Lobo, to 24 years in prison for conspiring to import cocaine into the United States.
Meanwhile, in other news, Honduran police opened fire on protesters earlier this week, marking the first anniversary of last year's disputed election that kept Juan Orlando Hernandez in power despite calls by the Organization of American States to redo the vote. Honduras has been in a political crisis for nearly a decade following the U.S.-backed coup that ousted democratically elected President Manuel Zelaya in 2009. Since then, right-wing forces have led a campaign targeting activists in Honduras, including the prominent activist Berta Cáceres, who was gunned down in 2016 in her home in La Esperanza, Honduras. 8 men are currently on trial for involvement in her murder. A verdict could come as early as today. To talk more about Honduras and why so many migrants are fleeing the country, we're joined by Dana Frank, Professor Emerita of the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her new book is just out. It's titled The Long Honduran Night: Resistance, Terror, and the United States in the Aftermath of the Coup. She recently wrote a piece for Jacobin headlined "In Honduras, We're Supporting the Axe Murderers." Professor Franks, thanks so much for being with us. Why don't you start off by talking about the significance of the current president, a highly contested race that many considered fraught with irregularities, the current president's brother arrested in Miami for drug trafficking?
Well, we've known for a long time, 2 years now, that Juan Orlando's brother, Tony, was involved in drug trafficking. He was, in fact, named in U.S. federal court 2 years ago. And we know that there are drug traffickers from top to bottom in the Honduran government. So for Hondurans, this is no surprise. What's important is that he actually was arrested and is going to be presumably brought to justice. What this signals, though, is what people call an outsourcing of the criminal justice system. Why was he not brought to justice in the United States? Excuse me. Why was he not brought to justice in Honduras? It shows that there's complete breakdown of the Honduran criminal justice system, that this man wasn't brought to justice a long time ago in Honduras.
And Dana Frank, according to the federal indictment, the authorities actually have videotape and audio recordings of Tony Hernandez receiving a $50,000 payment from drug dealers for his work on their behalf. Is it conceivable that all of this occurred and the president, the brother of Tony Hernandez, the current president, knew nothing about it?
No, and of course there's also testimony where people have said that Juan Orlando himself is involved in drug trafficking. There's evidence about his sister, who died in a helicopter accident a year ago, was involved in drug trafficking. So this is not just an isolated incident. We have evidence of drug traffickers top to bottom throughout the Honduran government, including in the current Congress.
Do you think it's fair to say Honduras is coming close to a narco state?
Well, I think that it's a narco state. I guess it depends on your definition of a narco state. Certainly, it's not like you can say, here's the Honduran government fighting the good fight against drug traffickers. And that doesn't work. There's a lot of people say, well, we'll pour this money into the Honduran security forces and they'll fight drug trafficking, because the Honduran military is very much involved in drug trafficking as well. And so it's certainly infiltrated with drug traffickers from top to bottom.
Well, Dana Frank, your book comes at a particularly important time, as clearly the whole nation has been seeing what's been going on at the U.S.-Mexico border with the caravan of migrants from Central America, most of them from Honduras. But there is very little discussion of what is forcing them to leave. And if you could talk about what has been the night of terror that has descended on Honduras, especially following the 2009 coup against 2009 coup against President Zelaya.
Well, when you read the interviews or the mainstream news reports about why the migrants are in the caravan or fleeing, they'll say, well, they're fleeing gangs and violence and poverty. And that's true. But what's missing from that narrative is where the gangs and violence and poverty come from. It's not a natural disaster. It's actually the result of the deliberate policies of this government that came to the successive what we call the post-regime governments that came to power in the aftermath of the coup, most recently the illegal government of Juan Orlando Hernandez. And, so if you look at those causes, where does all the violence and the gang terror come from? It comes from this almost complete destruction of the rule of law. The coup itself was a criminal act, but it's also that it opened the doors for every kind of conceivable criminal activity. In that context, the gangs proliferated, drug trafficking proliferated, they're infiltrated throughout the police and military. So you have this situation in which the government itself is implicated in these gangs and in this military that people are fleeing. So it's not just random violence. It's a U.S.-backed regime that is in cahoots with this. For example, a lot of people are fleeing gangs or small business people, their businesses are being destroyed by gang taxes. The police are very much cooperating with the gangs in extracting those kinds of so-called war taxes that the gang members pay. That the gang members charge. So it's this destruction, it's this lawlessness that then opens the door for this kind of terror that people are fleeing, and the government is very much part of that terror. The second factor here is poverty, because people are very much fleeing poverty, but that poverty, again, is not a natural disaster. It's the direct result of the post-coup policies, because, first of all, the state itself has been destroyed both by neoliberal policies of multilateral development banks like the International Monetary Fund. State services have been destroyed because the elites that run the government are just robbing it blind. For example, the president and his party stole as many as $90 million from the National Health Service in 2013 to pay for their campaigns. And so then there's no National Health Service that functions. And but also the sectors that of the economy that are supposed to be the growth sectors are, in fact, the ones that are destroying the livelihoods. So, for example, palm oil production is being imposed at the point of a gun, that kills campesinos who are trying to defend other forms of agriculture. Extractive mining projects and hydroelectric dams are what are forcing indigenous peoples off their land, and that's why Alberto Cáceres, the famous leader, was killed in 2016. So these things that are the tourism is forcing the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna people off their land at the point of a gun. The only other functional sectors are agriculture and the maquiladora sector, which is apparel and electronics factories for the export market. And those are very, very destructive of people's bodies under really repressive working conditions. So when we hear about economic development in Honduras, it's actually accelerating more of this destruction along with the gang activity that is destroying small businesses because it's not viable to have a small business. I know a lot of small business people I know of people that have been killed if they didn't pay the taxes or they reported it to the police. So there are no other options here. And the other piece of this is those who are trying to have an alternative economic future for Honduras through Libre, the opposition party, through social movements at the base. These are the people that are getting tear gassed, just like at the U.S. border. These are the people that are getting assassinated. The journalists that report on this alternative vision and the people who would like some kind of democratic alternative, these people are being repressed. So that's the other piece of this if you're trying to actually achieve some alternative economic model.
I wanted to ask you about the repression in the countryside, because I thought that was some of the most graphic material that you had in your book about especially the escalation of the repression, not immediately after the coup in 2009, but in 2011, after Manuel Zelaya comes back as a result of a brokered agreement between Venezuela, the leaders of Venezuela and Colombia, other Latin American countries, for him to come back to the country, that actually in places like the Aguan Valley, the campesinos were subjected to even greater mass repression.
Well, some of that is because the campesinos who had these collectives that had been in place for a long time and were being forced off their land started reoccupying land that they'd been forced off of by these neoliberal policies, and particularly members of the elite, especially Miguel Facuse and his D9 Corporation. So as they start reoccupying their lands and following agrarian reform, legal processes for reclaiming their lands, then they start being killed one by one, two by two, and what we could call a slow-moving massacre. As many as 150 campesinos have been assassinated in the Aguan Valley beginning in 2010.
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. Dana Frank, Professor Emerita, University of California, Santa Cruz, her new book, The Long Honduran Night, Resistance, Terror, and the United States and the Aftermath of the Coup. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Cuando me vine de mi tierra, El Salvador, con la intención de llegar a Estados Unidos, sabía que necesitaría más que valor, sabía que a lo mejor quedaba en el camino. Son 3 fronteras las que tuve que cruzar, por 3 países anduve indocumentado, 3 veces tuve yo la vida que arriesgar, por eso dicen que soy 3 veces mojado. Por Guatemala y México cuando crucé, 3 veces me salvé, me hicieron...
Pacíficos de Tijuana. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report, as we continue our conversation with Dana Frank, Professor Emerita, University of California, Santa Cruz. Her new book, The Long Honduran Night, Resistance, Terror, and the United States in the Aftermath of the Coup. I wanted to go back to 2009, when there was a coup in Honduras, and the democratically elected leader, the Honduran president, Manuel Zelaya, spoke on Democracy Now! About what happened to him.
They attacked my house at 5:30 in the morning. A group of at least 200 to 250 armed soldiers with hoods and bulletproof vests and rifles aimed their guns at me, fired shots, used machine guns, kicked down the doors, and just as I was in pajamas, they put me on a plane and flew me to Costa Rica. This all happened in less than 45 minutes.
That was Manuel Zelaya. Democracy Now! Followed him back to Honduras after he was flown back, but that brokered agreement. We flew on the plane with him from Nicaragua to Honduras. But the new regime was put in place, the coup regime. Porfirio Lobo, whose son has now been sentenced to well over 20 years in prison for drug trafficking. And Dana Frank, I was wondering if you can just talk about this history that went from the Democrats. I mean, Juan, when you interviewed Hillary Clinton when she was running for president, when you were working at the Daily News, you asked her about the coup. She was not pleased. You asked her about her support, the U.S. support for the coup when she was Secretary of State. So it went from the Democrats right through to President Trump. And if you can talk about the extent of this support and why you see that linked to what we're seeing with the migrants today. As you say, these are refugees from U.S. policy.
Well, we don't have a smoking gun that shows the U.S. backed the coup from before it happened. But all the evidence is very clear that the U.S. wanted the coup to stabilize after it took place, that the U.S. recognized the bogus election of November 2019 that brought Porfirio Lobo to power, and that the U.S. has continued to recognize the ongoing coup regime, especially that of Juan Orlando Hernandez, although he has come in, he stole an election, we don't really know, in 2013. He very clearly ran for president last year in violation of the Constitution, which bans re-election, and then he stole the election in November last year.
Against Salvador Nasrallah.
Yeah, against a united opposition, which very clearly won. So the U.S. has given, but it's not just a question of the U.S. supporting the coup itself. I mean, clearly Hillary Clinton was responsible for that, but don't forget that Barack Obama was her boss, and he's responsible too. But it's not just that moment. The U.S. could have recognized Xiomara Castro, Zelaya's wife, when she probably won the election in 2013. The U.S. could have intervened, or not intervened, excuse me. The U.S. could have protested when Juan Orlando Hernandez overthrew the Supreme Court in 2012 when he was president of Congress. The U.S. could have protested when he ran for re-election. And, of course, it could have called for a new election last winter or recognized the outcome of Nasrallah as the winner last winter's elections. The U.S. has given this post-coup regime green light after green light after green light. So it's not just Obama, it's not just Hillary Clinton, it's also John Kerry and now Donald Trump and his secretaries of state, Tillerson, Pompeo, John Bolton at the National Security Council, Senator Marco Rubio, who is reportedly the person advising Pompeo on U.S. policy in Honduras right now. So this is an ongoing policy, and the Hondurans will be very quick to tell you that the Juan Orlando's regime continues because of U.S. support, not just the police and military aid, which is pouring in, but this legitimation of the regime. And if you want to see the continuities, the key figure here is General John Kelly, who was the head of the United States Southern Command out of Miami before he was chief of staff for Trump. And he very much has supported Juan Orlando Hernandez. He called him a magnificent guy and a good friend. And here's how we can see this continuity from one regime to the next.
You say that there is no smoking gun in terms of the U.S. involvement, but your book does talk about a highly unusual meeting that happened the night before the coup between the key general who led the coup and a U.S. official.
Yeah, that's Jake Johnson's research for The Intercept. I mean, we have a top U.S. official, the liaison to the military, I think he was, meeting with General Romeo Velasquez the night before and then leaving a U.S. embassy party that night and coming back. So that's the best we have that the U.S. knew about it. And, Hillary Clinton says in her autobiography that she was at the pool in Cape Cod and she was surprised by the phone call. And she also famously says we helped them with the election of 2009 make the question of Zelaya's return moot. And that was so outrageous that she said that. She actually took it out of the paperback edition of her autobiography.
So you have now a situation where you have thousands of Hondurans that are fleeing to the U.S. border. Your response to the tear gassing, which we're going to be talking about in our next segment of the migrants, and also Mexico's incoming foreign minister, not the government of Peña Nieto, but the government of AMLO, of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, saying that the that they have agreed to wait, that the migrants should stay waiting on Mexican soil as they wait to hear their appeals, but that in return, the U.S. government should pay at least $20 billion for a Marshall Plan-style program aimed at developing the economies of Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
Well, two things here. One is that obviously the use of the tear gas is terrifying, as is the presence of the U.S. military at the border in violation of the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act. So let's mark that, as well as tear gas fired into a foreign country against people, terrified, starving people trying to seek legal asylum applications in the United States. So this is a terrifying, militarized response to these refugees, really, I think, so morally disturbing, and also illegal use of federal troops here, and that's the Border Patrol shooting it. But, I mean, this is a very terrifying militarization of our own border. And I want to make the parallel of that to the militarization, the U.S.-funded militarization within Honduras, because now the Honduran military is also, since 2014, with the so-called crisis of undocumented, unaccompanied minors coming to the United States, the Honduran military actively stops people from leaving their own country. And these are U.S.-funded and trained forces that are doing that. And I find this armed encirclement terrifying. And, of course, this same tear gas, which is often manufactured in the United States, is used against peaceful protesters and bystanders in Honduras for years and years and years. I have this story in the book about a friend of mine saying in the first couple months after the 2000 coup that he was learning to taste all the different flavors and types of tear gas that were being used against Hondurans after the coup. And this has just been going on in the last week against the protests on the anniversary of the stolen election. So I want to underscore that there's these militarized parallels of what's going on in both countries. And then this question of the $20 billion Marshall Plan. Well, I don't know if people remember after the so-called crisis unaccompanied children coming to the United States in 2014, the Obama administration's response was something called the Biden Plan, promoted by Vice President Joe Biden, that wanted to give $1 billion to the governments of the so-called Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, in order to stop migration and address root causes. And if you look at that, and it was $750 million of that was eventually funded by Congress, if you look at that, it's pouring precisely into the same security forces and sectors of the economy that are causing the very repression, the very destruction of the economy that people are fleeing. So when you start hearing, of course, we're all watching to see what López Obrador is going to do in Mexico. But and of course, the Honduran economy does need to be rebuilt, but not according to a model run by the current U.S. government and run by the repressive regime of Juan Orlando Hernández and the Honduran elites. And that's what's so terrifying here is, like, you pour that kind of money in the same model, and we've been down this road before, and you're just handing money over to the elites to steal and use it to really terrorize their people over and over again at higher and higher levels.
And Dana Frank, one of the most interesting parts of your book is your portrayal of this enormous and widespread popular movement that develops after the coup against Zelaya. And you contrasted, and rightfully so, that back in the 80s, Honduras was a relatively quiet place while El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala were all embroiled in major civil conflicts and uprisings and government repression. But yet Honduras, I remember being there in 1990, and it was then a terrorized state. There were military all over the place, but there wasn't the kind of popular movement that somehow developed after the coup against Zelaya. Could you talk about that and how it inspired you and shaped your own thinking of your role as an academic?
Yeah, there certainly was an active left in Honduras in the 80s, but much smaller scale than in the other countries, and tremendously repressed by some of the figures that are currently popping up again since the coup in Honduras. The Honduran resistance was, and still is, a tremendously beautiful thing that was a great surprise, although in retrospect you could see the social movements that were building at the grassroots, in the women's movement, the campesino movement, the indigenous movement, the Afro-Indigenous movement, and human rights defenders. And when the coup happened, people poured into the streets and formed this tremendous coalition called the National Front of Popular Resistance, known as the Frente or the Resistencia, which was amazing coalition, not just of the folks I just named, but of the labor movement, the LGBT movement, but also people committed to the constitutional rule of law. It wasn't about so-called Zelaya supporters, as it was often framed, but people who were committed to a positive transformation of Honduras, as well as defending the constitutional rule of law, which is something, of course, resonates differently in the United States today, with Trump threatening the constitutional rule of law all over the place. And that resistance was a very beautiful thing. And in the first chapter of my book, I wanted the reader to really feel the joy of it, as both the terror and the joy of the creativity, of the music, of the humor, the bravery, the graffiti, and the way it changed Honduran culture for good. And made people proud of their resistance, and discovering ties across different social movements in a massive coalition of the kind that we fantasize of in the United States today. Unfortunately, that resistance has been repressed and repressed and repressed. A lot of key figures are now in exile. People have been killed. Journalists that cover it are killed or in exile. And so it's been also terrifying to watch that repression, but also Hondurans have that in their hearts, that they know what they can do and how they could feel a beautiful sense of solidarity.
As you talk about the resistance, I wanted to ask you about Berta Cáceres. 8 men on trial in Honduras right now accused of murdering the great environmentalist. She was gunned down in her home in La Esperanza in 2016. A verdict is expected any moment. Her assassination came a year after she won the Goldman Environmental Prize for her work protecting indigenous communities and her campaign against a massive hydroelectric dam project. This is Berta Cáceres speaking in 2015.
In our
worldviews, we are beings who come from the earth, from the water, and from corn. The Lenca people are ancestral guardians of the rivers, in turn protected by the spirits of young girls, who teach us that giving our lives in various ways for the protection of the rivers is giving our lives for the well-being of humanity and of this planet.
That was Berta Cáceres receiving the Goldman Prize in San Francisco. She would go home and she would be killed. Dana Frank, talk about the trial. Who's involved? Who is on trial and who isn't?
Well, there are 8 men on trial, one of whom was an active duty military officer in charge of military intelligence at the time. Another one was a former military officer. They do seem to have been the material authors of the crime itself. But it's really 2 things to underscore. One is they're not the only actors here. There are other Honduran elites that the evidence very clearly points toward that are not being charged, or when they're being charged, they're mounting some really incredibly well-funded PR campaigns saying that they are victims of human rights abuses, which is really far-fetched. And so the first thing is we don't have not everybody has been charged that is responsible for paying for and calling for her assassination. And the second thing is the trial itself has been a tragedy, a travesty. That the government prosecutors have not introduced or taken into account a vast range of evidence of text messages, seized computer messages, phone call records that implicate all kinds of people, and they're not taking that into account. And also Honduran law says that the family of the victim has the right to review all the evidence, has the right to be there in court, and that's been violated over and over and over again. So we're going to get some kind of verdict. Probably somebody's going to take a fall for this, but we should not in any way confuse that with justice for Berta. Anything that is, the fact that there is even a trial is mostly because of international pressure, including from the United States Congress and people like yourselves. There's going to be a lot of pressure to act like somehow the justice has been done, and we're going to put this under the rug. What's the word? Sweep it under the rug. And that's really important to say that this is not going to be justice for Berta. This is going to be some kind of something for show, as they say in Honduras. and that we still have to call for justice for Berta and have the true perpetrators fully brought to justice.
And Dana, we just have about a minute, but I wanted to ask you, in your book, you also talk about your frustration in dealing with Congress and the constantly changing staff members there who don't seem to have institutional memory about what's going on with Honduras, the lack of ability for people in Congress to actually act and do something about what's been going on there. Could you talk about that?
Well, part of the book is about, the middle parts of the book is about the solidarity movement in the North and my own efforts to try to do something because, and, you know, then I talk about going into like this morass that's the United States Congress and trying to get people to care. I mean, people didn't believe us for many years. But also I talk about the people that did care. And and in the book, I talk about particular staffers and Congress members and senators that did care. And, you know, it's a what do I say about Congress here in Washington, D.C. right now? You know, it's a minefield, and it's a easily corrupted minefield. But I also want to say something that I think has disappeared from the mainstream media, is that there has been also tremendous and beautiful congressional interest on the Democratic side in what's been going on in Honduras. I mean, people may not know that there are 71 members of the House currently on record.
We've just lost Dana Frank by satellite. We want to thank her for being with us. Dana Frank, Professor Emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her book is just out. It's titled The Long Honduran Night: Resistance, Terror, and the United States in the Aftermath of the Coup. She's going to be speaking about her book in Brooklyn on Thursday night. She'll be interviewed by Juan Gonzalez at the Verso Loft at 20 J Street, and people can go there. It's at 7 to 9 p.m. That does it for that interview, but we're going to continue on the issue of the use of the tear gas being shot at women and children along the border. We'll look at the use of tear gas by U.S. security. Stay with us.
Le dije a mi madre, me voy para el norte. De pura tristeza se puso a llorar. Y en ese momento me sentí muy triste. Porque a mi familia tuve que dejar. Me di media vuelta, seguí caminando.
Cross the border by Los Plebes de San Luis. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
As the Trump administration continues to defend firing tear gas into crowds of asylum seekers at the U.S.-Mexico border, we spend the rest of the hour looking at the history of tear gas, which is banned in warfare, but legal for federal authorities and police to turn on civilians. Border authorities' use of tear gas has spiked under the Trump administration, with the agency's own data revealing it has deployed tear gas over 24 times this year alone. Customs and Border Protection told Newsweek Tuesday it began using tear gas under the Obama administration in 2010 and has released the substance 126 times since the year 2012. The agency's use of tear gas has now reached a 7-year record high under the Trump administration. On Monday, President Trump was asked about the tear gassing of women and children migrants.
How did you feel when you saw the images of the women and children running from the tear gas?
Well, I do say, why are they there? I mean, I have to start off. First of all, the tear gas is a very minor form of the tear gas itself. It's very safe. The ones that were suffering to a certain extent were the people that were putting it out there.
President Trump claimed border agents used a minor form of tear gas, but Customs and Border Protection later acknowledged there's only one form of the gas that is commonly used. Ronald Colburn, the president of the Border Patrol Foundation and former National Deputy Chief of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, spoke on Fox and Friends Monday morning.
The type of deterrent being used is OC pepper spray. It's literally water, pepper, with a small amount of alcohol for evaporation purposes. It's natural. You could actually put it on your nachos and eat it. So it's a good way of deterring people without long-term harm.
You can actually put it on your nachos and eat it. Tear gas is banned by international law under the Chemical Weapons Convention. The American Academy of Pediatrics said in a statement, the use of tear gas on children, including infants and toddlers in diapers, goes against evidence-based recommendations and threatens their short and long-term health. Well, for more, we go to Baltimore, Maryland, where we're joined by Stuart Schrader, lecturer in sociology at Johns Hopkins University. He studied how tear gas went from a weapon of war used in Vietnam to being deployed by law enforcement at home. His forthcoming book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. Stuart Schrader, welcome to Democracy Now! First, respond to what President Trump and the head of the Border Patrol Foundation said about the tear gas and the fact that it was shot at women and children on the border by U.S. forces.
Well, both of these statements are misleading. In the case of President Trump's statement, he is trying to claim that the tear gas is a mild form, and that's simply untrue. The tear gas that was used is a chemical called CS, and the guy from the Border Patrol is also being misleading because he's referring to pepper spray, and again, it was CS that was used. And CS is a extremely powerful chemical, and the term tear gas, when referring to CS, is misleading because it doesn't just make your eyes tear when it affects your body. It also makes all of your mucous membranes become inflamed. You expel large amounts of mucus. You cough. You feel like you can't breathe. You feel like you're choking. So the term tear gas doesn't really describe the effects that are the result of this chemical.
And what is the difference between pepper spray and tear gas?
Well, they're chemically different substances, and they're also the delivery methods are different. The CS that was deployed on the border came out of grenades, and it came, most people saw images of these kind of clouds of smoke. Pepper spray is a more directed blast that is usually shot between, one law enforcement officer and, one person or a small crowd of people. Instead, the CS grenades that were used, they diffuse a large cloud of the chemical that, can basically engulf anyone who's within the vicinity.
Yesterday, I quoted Karen Attias, the editor for Jamel Khashoggi. She's the global news editor at the Washington Post, saying that if American media were describing if this happened in a non-Western country, American security forces under the Trump regime used chemical weapons in a cross-border operation against unarmed asylum seekers, including children. My God. So, Stuart Schrader, can you talk about the history of the use of CS gas? I mean, I don't think people understand. This gas that was used on the women and children who are fleeing persecution and poverty is considered illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention?
Yeah, that's correct. The history of CS is a fairly long history. The first ban on chemical weapons that was put into place was all the way back in 1925, and that did not cover CS because CS had not yet been invented. Also, the United States did not ratify that agreement way back when. CS was invented a few years later, and it really came into much more widespread use and was adopted by the U.S. military in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Until that point, there was another form of tear gas that was used, again, acknowledging that the term tear gas is misleading, and the U.S. military phased that out. That's called CN. It phased it out over the course of the 1960s and replaced it with CS. And the reason was that CS was just much more severe and intense in its effects. And so beginning in the 1960s, the U.S. military started to use CS in its operations, predominantly in South Vietnam. And when this news hit, newspapers in the United States in 1965 that the United States was using gas, the Johnson administration quite quickly tried to downplay the use of the gas. First of all, they wanted to make sure that everybody knew that it was not violating any kind of international treaty, that it was not using mustard gas or something along those lines. But they also made the effort to downplay the severity of CS. And in this way, there's actually a strange parallel between Lyndon Johnson and Donald Trump, probably the only one that could be drawn, which is that they both have claimed that tear gas, CS, is not so bad. And so Lyndon Johnson, his Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, they all claimed that the use of CS beginning in 1965 in Vietnam was no big deal and nothing to be concerned about. But in fact, the effects of CS at the time were severe, and CS came to be used in really, really large amounts, copious amounts, throughout the U.S. war in Vietnam during the 1960s.
And how then did the use of CS then migrate to domestic police departments especially after 1968? What was the logic then of how that came about?
Well, when it was used in Vietnam, it was used in two primary ways. Although it was often claimed that it was being used in the setting of riot control, that wasn't actually the case. In fact, it was used in combat, and one purpose was used to flush people out of hiding. So if people were hiding in bunkers or in tunnels or even just in heavy vegetation, CS would be used to try to force them out because, of course, the main problem for the United States military during the war in Vietnam was finding the people that they wanted to target as the enemy. So CS was used to force people out because the response that anybody would have to it is basically to flee, as we saw in pictures just the other day. So once people revealed their location, then the U.S. military could target them with more conventional weapons, from airstrikes to bullets. And another reason or another purpose of CS was to then contaminate those hiding spaces, bunkers and tunnels. They would be filled with CS, and then people couldn't go in them and hide after the U.S. military left. Now, these purposes were not the immediate purposes that were used after 1968 in the United States by law enforcement. Rather, it was used in riot control starting in 1968. Now, in 1967, there were, large, well-known incidents of urban unrest in cities like Newark and Detroit, and the National Guard was deployed, and the National Guard in these incidents used bullets. They used rifles, and they shot a lot of bullets. Something like 10,000 bullets were fired by the National Guard in Newark in 1967, and they fired no tear gas grenades. Now, if you fast forward from July of 1967 to April of 1968, when there was unrest after the assassination of Martin Luther King in cities like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore and others, the National Guard fired less than 20 bullets, but they used something like almost 6,000 CS grenades. Now, the reason for this really rapid and dramatic transformation in their tactics and riot control was that after the experience in the summer of 1967, the Johnson administration appointed the Kerner Commission, which did a really extensive investigation into the causes of the unrest and also into remedies for preventing it in the future. Now, of course, they recommended a remedy of alleviating poverty and racism, but that didn't happen. And instead, what did happen was that they had some recommendations about how to change policing, one of which was to use CS. And that recommendation mostly came from experts who were already working overseas in the setting of counterinsurgency and other types of counter-subversive activity.
We clearly need a part two on this, but who makes CS? We have 15 seconds.
CS is made by American companies as well as other companies around the world.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. Stuart Schrader, lecturer in sociology at Johns Hopkins University. His forthcoming book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Nadura, Tay Marie Estudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, our engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley and Julie Crosby. Again, Juan Gonzalez tomorrow night will be at the Verso Loft at 20 J Street interviewing Dana Frank. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan.